to NCORE, to the University of Oklahoma. That logo of the seed sower already makes my day. But you, in all your diversity and beauty, make my heart fill with joy. You know, there are times I have to address a hall full of black suits, of sameness and uniformity. And you take me back to our beautiful Navdanya farm, where we grow 2,000 varieties of crops from land that 30 years ago was an absolute desert, left by a eucalyptus monoculture. And the fact that you are both diverse in yourselves and dedicated to diversity is what makes me feel so happy being with you, because that's what my life has become, dedication to diversity. Both sowing the seeds of diversity, cultivating diversity, cultural and biological, but most importantly, thinking diversity. Because our minds have been so filled with the idea of monocultures, the idea of the domination of one species over the 300 million of which we are a part. The domination of, today, 4 crops, when we used to eat 8,500 species, kind of becoming a corn and soya, and a genetically modified corn and soya planet. And we're always told it's for feeding the world, but only 10% of GM corn and soya goes to food. The rest is going to biofuel, or it's going to torture animals. The bovine were given 10 stomachs to deal with grass. That's why they're called herbivores. They wanted herbs. They didn't want soya, and they definitely didn't want rendered meat. You know, rendering is an interesting subject. It's what happens to people when they're picked up in strange places, but it's also what happens to dead infected animals when they're ground up and fed to other animals. And that's what led to the mad cow epidemic that ended up killing 12 people in England, and then you had a ban on rendering. But our food has become so mysterious. There is no knowing what's in it, how it is grown, where it was grown. And I find it totally fascinating that a country which is supposed to be a democracy has denied to its people the right to know what they eat. And the labeling battles in this country are fascinating. Not only were 2 major initiatives in California and Washington defeated by money, but now that Vermont, which doesn't allow the rule of money that easily, managed to get a labeling law, immediately there are threats of suing. And there's a law that's been put forward to Congress called Accurate Labeling Law. And it's basically to prevent states from making their own labeling laws. And it's sponsored by my favorite company, Monsanto, and 2 brothers who ended up becoming the richest in the world, the Koch brothers. So we had the reduction of 300 million species and thousands of cultures, more than 6,500 languages spoken around the world. In India, Anthropological Survey says 2,000, some of them spoken by tribes that are very, very small now. But language is just one aspect of cultural diversity. The ways of our eating, the ways of our clothing, the ways of our imagination are all part of that diversity. And then we had the rise of progress, which came hand in hand with colonization. And the only reason I'm grateful for colonization is that it brought us all together. So Columbus was sailing for India to get the textiles, the spices, which were the centerpieces of international trade at that time. He thought he landed in India when he landed in North America, and forever, Native Americans have been called Indians. So I thank Columbus's blunder for making us all Indians. But of course, what happened to the Native Americans and what happened to my country and what happened to Africans who were picked up as slaves is one connection out of a series of real conquest and false narratives that have given us today's world full of the crises that we see unravel in different parts of the world, and the fact that 70% of the ecosystems of this planet are today on the verge of collapse. Of course, societies are disintegrating so unpredictably. Who would have imagined 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that Syria would be in the shape it is, or Egypt, or Ukraine? The reduction of 300 million species to one, which is called anthropocentrism, was more than anthropocentrism, because it wasn't the species as a whole that said, butterflies and bees, we're going to wipe you out. Soil organisms and earthworms will poison you to death. Fish in the ocean, we will overexploit you. No, it was a very small section of the human species that rose at the cost of other humans also, not just at the cost of other species. So women were denied their subjecthood. Every non-European culture, non-Christian culture, non-white culture was denied its humanity, personhood, autonomy, sovereignty. The Native Americans were called primitive because they lived in peace with nature. And the New England governor, who happened to be the person who then later gave us the Boyle's Law, said that one of his objectives was to rid the Native Americans of the false idea that nature has to be venerated. This is what he said. He explicitly declared his intention of ridding the New England Indians of their ridiculous notions about the workings of nature. He attacked the perception of nature as a kind of goddess and argued that the veneration wherewith men are imbued for what they call nature has been a discouraging impediment to the empire of man over inferior creatures of God. And that empire of man was very dedicatedly constructed. It didn't happen. It wasn't a natural evolution of humanity. As a physicist, I studied quantum theory, and I learned that everything is connected. My PhD thesis was on non-separability in quantum theory. But later, when I worked with my sisters in the Chipko movement, who said, we're going to hug the trees to protect our forests. You'll have to kill us before you kill the trees. Chipko means to embrace. And it was my school for both diversity as well as ecological activism. I realized that what they were facing was a monoculture of the mind in forestry, where it was assumed that the only valuable thing in a forest was the timber that could be killed, cut down, and sold. It was square feet of dead wood. And women changed. Illiterate women changed the paradigm of forestry. I remember a particular instant, it must have been 1977, And the women came out with lanterns in their hand, and during the daytime, to protect this forest. And the police was there, and the foresters were there, and they said, "You stupid women, can't you see that the sun is out? You don't need the lantern." And they said, "No, it's not the sun to which we are showing the light. We're showing it to you. You think the forest bears profits and timber. We want to tell you the forest bears soil, water, and pure air." It took 10 years, but eventually we got a logging ban and the recognition that high mountain forests are protectors while they stand. Their value is in the living forest, not in the dead timber. And today, worldwide, they're talking about ecological functions of natural systems. Ecological functions in providing water, in building soil, in absorbing carbon that we have emitted into the atmosphere, way beyond the atmosphere's capacity to recycle it. 40 years too late, the dominant system is starting to understand that nature is not just dead matter to be exploited. Now, I take deep pride in being a physicist, but I take deep pride in not being a mechanical physicist. Because the mechanistic reductionist paradigm has given us so much of the blindness to diversity, to life, to freedom. Bacon, who's called the father of modern science, said nature had to be raped in order to know her secrets. He even wrote a book called The Birth of Masculine Time, as if time began when dominant masculinity took over. And he said that mechanical inventions require that we do not just merely exert a gentle guidance over nature's course. They have to have the power to conquer and subdue her, to shake her to her very foundations. And we are experiencing that shaking to the foundations in terms of the imminent collapse of more and more ecosystems, and most significantly, the fact that we are destroying the very conditions of human life on Earth. The planet will carry on one way or the other. The Earth is too resilient. But we humans can only survive at a certain temperature. We don't have the capacity to live at 60 degrees centigrade. Now the Royal Society, and I gave a lecture for the Royal Society a few years ago, I couldn't believe it. Their whole dedication was to follow Bacon's path, to raise a masculine philosophy, whereby the mind of man may be ennobled with the knowledge of solid truths. Now, in a world of interconnections, and in a world of the web of life, and your logo is about webs and interconnections, we need a bit of liquid to move. The solid belongs to that false idea that the world is made of immutable objects, separate from each other. And that has been applied not just to natural philosophy, but also to social sciences, of atomized, fragmented human beings, disconnected from each other, in competition with each other, using force to dominate over each other. Each of these is a construct that is not true. The idea of these solid truths has allowed so much violence to be perpetrated on both the earth and on humanity. It allowed the assumption to rise that nature is just dead matter, and that knowledge of a living nature is ignorance. In those days, they used to call it superstition. We were all superstitious that the earth lives, that our bodies are alive, that every cell in our body is alive. Today, science recognizes that the 50 trillion cells working in harmony in our bodies are not just alive, but they're working intelligently. That the intelligence is there at every level of life, from the planet to the tiniest of microbes and the tiniest of cells. This idea of a world of fragmentation and a mechanistic thought that was a very masculine idea and was created to create the empire of man over nature, also created a separation. I have called it eco-apartheid. The apartheid that was put in place in South Africa was based on separation on the basis of race. And I think it must have been 1906 when they were starting to build the apartheid regime and forcing people to be identified by race, that Gandhi, who was then in South Africa, did his first civil disobedience. And he called it Satyagraha, the fight for truth. He says, we will not declare ourselves to be separated by race because we are one citizenry. And he refused to wear the badge of compulsory registration based on a racial regime. Interestingly, the date of that Satyagraha was 9/11. We call it the other 9/11. The 9/11 that celebrated the dignity of every person and did not turn diversity into a justification for domination and violence. The separation from nature and the idea that somehow some human beings can dominate over nature has given us the eco-apartheid, the idea of humans not being one of nature. But we are part of nature. The day we are really separate, we are dead. Because the air we breathe is part of the earth's air. The water we drink comes from the earth. The food we eat comes from the earth. There is nothing that makes our life possible that doesn't come from the earth. We are the earth, we are the soil, we are the water. But that has been changed into separation, and then the illusion, and this is what I've learned in the last 40 years of my work in ecological issues, the illusion that every time the powerful steal, they declare they create. So of course, Columbus discovered this amazing ancient land. And now Monsanto is inventing seed. She had introduced the prayer that women will say when they plant a seed, may the seed be exhaustless. Monsanto uses intelligence to say, let the seed get exhausted, let it be terminated. And if the crop is too intelligent for us to control it, then let us declare termination through legal form, which is what an intellectual property right says. An intellectual property right on seed is the assumption that seed is an invention. I sometimes joke and say, GMO means God move over. There is no place for creation. And I was invited in 1987 to a conference on the new biotechnologies, and there was no GMO in the world at that time. They were planning it. And the corporations were very honest. These were the old chemical industry that had come from the war, and they'd given us agri-chemicals, the pesticides, herbicides. Now they were saying, we've got to do genetic engineering because our next source of profits will be patenting life and collecting royalties. And we need to do this worldwide because it's not enough to do it in the US and Europe. Because the companies are 5 companies that are American and European companies. Monsanto, which was never in seed, is now the biggest controller and owner of seed through intellectual property. So they put in place the global intellectual property rights regime of the World Trade Organization. Monsanto is on record. Its representative James Enyart at a Washington, D.C. conference in 1995, after the WTO came into force, said, "We've achieved something unprecedented. We wrote the rules, we defined what was a problem, and now we have the solution. We were the patient, diagnostician, physician all in one." As a patient, what was their sickness? They were ill because farmers do their ecological duty to the earth. They save seeds. That was Monsanto's sickness. And the solution was make it illegal, make it a crime. I'm not going to go into details of the cases that illustrate how unjust this is. The 1,500 farmers of this country sued. The Canadian farmer Percy Smicer. Bauman sued because he bought grain in the market and sold it. And then the Supreme Court rules, it doesn't matter how far down the line the seed or grain is, it's still the property of Monsanto. In India, royalty collection has made seed price of cotton jump 8,000%. Farmers are in deep debt, and indebted farmers are committing suicide. The number in the last 15 years is 284,000. You know, when 500 people are killed, we call it a genocide. 284,000 farmers are killed. And all that's done is all the media is mobilized, and a lot of researchers mobilized to say it's not happening. It's official data, it's government data, it's the statistics of our National Bureau of Crime Records. And not only have we reduced the diversity of our species and the diversity of humanity to the privilege of one species, we've then created a patriarchal science around it, and even more tragically, a patriarchal economics around it. And not having been trained in either of these disciplines, none of these constructions come naturally to me. I look at them and say, my God, how could they cook that one up? I mean, how could they cook up the fact that in this amazing planet, with the amazing people, nature is reduced to land as a commodity, and people are reduced to labor as an input into production system. And money, which was supposed to be just a means between us of transacting, has been elevated to capital. I was trying to figure out, where did the word capital come from? Well, the Latin roots are caput. And of course, sometimes we say caput means finished, but caput meant heads. And in those days, you measured your caput on the basis of how many animals you have. But they were still real animals you had to look after. Not only did capital become superior, a construction became superior to creative species and creative human beings, it became the master. It became the owner. And I was sent a wonderful book for which I wrote a promotional blurb by Ronnie Lessam and Alexander Scheffer. And they've written, and I think this is so striking, if the fathers of capitalist theory had chosen a mother rather than a single bourgeois male as the smallest economic unit for their theoretical constructions, they would not have been able to formulate the axiom of the selfish nature of human beings in the way they did. So the celebration of greed, the celebration of competition became the norm. But first we create the construct of capital, and then those who control capital decide there's still responsibilities. So how do you get rid of responsibility? You create the limited liability corporation. The East India Company was the first limited liability corporation. When the gold comes back on your ship, it's yours. if the Spanish stole it, then society must bear the costs of that particular trip. Because those were the days of merchant adventurers. They were the traders. We are back in the days of merchant adventurers. Except now they hide behind the corporation as a person. And this is something fascinating that's happening in this country. When you sit far away and you hear about ruling after ruling, like the January 21st ruling of the Supreme Court, Citizen United, it basically said the corporation's power to steal democracy and the rights of the freedom of speech of ordinary citizens cannot be interfered in because corporations are person. And the ruling said it is a violation of corporations' civil liberties to limit their influence over the political process. We've cooked up a person. There's nothing like a person. It's a legal arrangement. And we've taken what was legal personhood and given it natural personhood, and then given it rights higher than real natural people. And this is what is causing so much of the problem for democracy, for freedom, for people's survival and livelihood. The 2008 crisis is linked to the fact that capital has become fictitious capital, 70 times more moving around than the real goods and services on the planet, and can predate on anything. And if the subprime crisis creates a disaster, go grab the food of the poor. Speculate on food, which is why food prices rise, which is why the bread protests of Egypt begin, and before you know it, they're deflected from being about bread to being about Mubarak and then about Christians and Muslims in the same society who've lived together. There's a whole new generation of free trade treaties being shaped. One is called TIP, the one with Europe, the Transatlantic Investment Treaty, and the other is called TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And all of them have three pushes. First is more intellectual property rights, more ownership of seed, of culture, of music, of everything that can be owned. Second is push GMOs, because a large part of the world doesn't want GMOs, and most part of the world is GMO-free. Our new government just announced that the last government's push for GMOs will be put on a back burner. There's going to be much more evaluation for biosafety, and we are not going to be a Monsanto republic. But for me, the most disturbing part of it is a bit like that rights, civil liberties of corporations decision in this country, and it is what are called investor trade suits. So you had money, which was constructed into capital. And now, capital has metamorphosed into a person through corporations and into investors. And investors now have rights. So if, for example, India refuses to allow GMOs, or Europe refuses to allow GMOs, the US won't sue as a state. Monsanto can sue the government of India and can sue the governments in Europe for not allowing GMOs. But everything that allows life has been either a public good or in the commons. And it's those public goods and commons that are now being seen as the source of profits through privatization. It could be our water, it could be our health systems, it could be our education, it could be our seeds, it could be the oceans, it could be the atmosphere. Everything is being seen as a commodity and a source for profits. Now, investor state suits, some of it has already happened. When Bolivia refused to recognize the privatization of its water, it was sued by Bechtel. You know, they threw Bechtel out, and then Bechtel sued. There's a company in California, and California is going to be important on the water issue because of the drought now. But California, a company called Sunbelt, wanted to import water from Canada. And the Canadians said, but we don't want to sell it. British Columbia said, but water is not a commodity. It's not a tradable commodity. We don't want to sell our water. They were sued for $8 billion for lost profits. Because the way it's done is, you calculate and say, if every seed was patented, I'd make $1 trillion profits. And then people rise and say, but seed is not invented. Sorry, you can't have that patent. Then Monsanto says, but I would have made $1 trillion profit, and you are stealing my profit, and therefore I will sue you. So the thieves become the one who sue those from whom they're stealing. And that's the ultimate in terms of how creating fictions and constructions has reached the limit. Now, in economics, besides the fact that the world was reduced to capital, labor, and land, during the war, it was reduced to GDP, the most powerful number. Every time someone says this is better for society, we are always told, sorry, it'll interfere in growth. Growth requires land grab. Growth requires laying off people from work. Growth requires getting rid of stable jobs and decent salaries. How did GDP get created? During the war, finances had to be mobilized to buy bigger tanks, bigger warships, bigger fighter bombers, and have bigger armies. So a definition was created, totally constructed. If you produce what you consume, you do not produce. So that everything you produced had to go out for sale, everything you consumed had to be bought, and through that, growth grew. Commodification increased. So nature, which produces and consumes, a hydrological cycle, is nature producing water and then consuming water and making it available forever. A seed planted in the soil gives rise to seed. Women reproducing not just the species, but reproducing society through their work and intelligence don't work. That's how women don't work comes up. So nature doesn't work, peasants don't work, people don't work, the working people don't work. I mean, you remember that little thing that was recorded during the last election in your country? About the working people, they could be taken care of? And isn't that an absurdity? That working people don't work, that mysterious capital sitting somewhere works. It creates value. It is the source of wealth. I work very closely with the government of Bhutan. We are helping them go 100% organic. And a few years ago, the government of Bhutan, the king said, no, we are not going to chase the GDP and growth obsession of the West. We're going to look after the welfare of our society and our ecosystems, and we will maximize gross national happiness and well-being. And I think the time has come to shift from the illusions that capital is the creative force of this planet to the recognition that nature and people are the creative force. And what they work towards is the happiness and well-being of all, not the profits of a few. In the case of food and agriculture, which is what I've ended up focusing on for the last 30 years because of the violence that I witnessed in my country, whether it was the violence of Bhopal, where 3,000 people died one night on 2nd December 1984, 30 years ago, or the violence of Punjab, where 30,000 people were killed in what I call 6 9/11s. 5,000 died in 9/11, New York. 30,000 were killed in extremism in Punjab. And then much more, because then that led to Indira Gandhi's assassination. She's in the army, she was assassinated, 3,006 were killed. in the capital in Delhi after that. All this is done in the name of producing more food. As I mentioned, only 10% GMO corn and soya is going to feed people. But 70% of the food still comes from small farms and gardens, largely on the basis of women's knowledge and work. And the figures are there for us to see. In Nigeria, where the Boko Haram is occupying the news, on 2% land, women produce 50% of the food. In Avdania's own work, we now don't measure yield, which tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you how much it costs. It doesn't tell you what's the nutrition. It doesn't tell you how much poison there is in it. What we measure is nutrition per acre, health per acre. And we find that if you take care of the earth, protect biodiversity, care for species, not only do pollinators come back, we have 6 times more pollinators on our farm than in the forest. The soil organisms come back, but healthy ecosystems give you more food. We don't have to grow food. We have to take care of the earth. And the earth gives us food. And we are at the stage where the intelligence of nature and people to produce more in non-violent ways is up against the false intelligence, the pseudo-intelligence of the final conquest of this planet, a conquest that can only lead to extinction. Look at the chemicals that are used in agriculture. I couldn't believe it. Roundup, of course, the most common chemical, machete, lasso, prowl, spectre, squadron, lightning, assert, avenge, kill. Is this supposed to be about life? Food is supposed to be about life, not about weapons of mass destruction. And so far, the BT crops and the herbicide-tolerant crops haven't really worked. They gave us super weeds and super pests. And in the United States, they are now allowing cultivation. They've given approval for Agent Orange resistant crops because the herbicide resistant crops of the Roundup generation have failed. Half of the farmland of this country has super weeds. So Agent Orange on your plates? Does that sound like a very intelligent idea? But my 2 favorite intelligence issues is they've been talking about a golden rice, and they've accused me of killing 2 million or maybe 200 million kids, because we've managed to show that so-called golden rice, which is a genetically engineered rice for vitamin A, will have 34 micrograms compared to the amazing biodiversity that the women of India and every part of the world use. The amaranth leaves with 1,000, coriander leaves 1,300, curry leaves 1,000 and more, drumstick leaves 1,200. 34,000? What is more vitamin A? And more recently, this amazing GMO banana. It has 0.44 units of iron. And they said, we'll increase it, we'll double it. We might even triple it. So it'll go to 1.5 milligrams. In our daily food, on the basis of women's knowledge and intelligence, turmeric 67. 1 versus 67. Just do the calculations in terms of percentages. We're talking about 6,000% inferior options. So whether it's the system as a whole or particular magic bullets, it is a failed thinking process, a failed paradigm. And the only thing it has on its side is violence. Against societies, militarized violence, against people, the kind of violence we see grow. It can only lead to ecocide, genocide, femicide. And the growth of violence against women is there for us all to witness. That is why I dedicate my life to not just service for the earth and the celebration of the diversity of people, but respect for the diversity of knowing, for allowing the resurrection of all our subjugated knowledges, all the subjugated values, as if caring and sharing is inferior to greed. It would be lovely in your universities to make a list of values, illusions we can get rid of, and the values that we need to nurture and cultivate. So we have the option of extinction through corporate globalization based on greed, based on thoughtlessness, based on short-term thinking, based on narrow-mindedness. Or we have a future based on earth democracy, the recognition that every life form, every species, every human being in all their diversity is not just there as a victim, but are the source of a rejuvenation of the possibility of human life on earth. We will all either have guns in our hands, as so many stories come out, the latest being Santa Barbara, or we will cultivate gardens. We will cultivate hope. We will cultivate diversity. And I have created the Earth University on our farm to learn from nature, to learn from diversity, to learn that making peace with the earth and between people is not a dream that we can't realize. Not only can we realize it, it is the only way we can even imagine a future for ourselves, because the other path is a predictable collapse. Thank you.